Welcome to Right to the Point, a podcast featuring honest conversation and biblical solutions to America's cultural challenges. Hi, I'm Tim Throckmorton of LifePoint Ministries. To learn more about LifePoint and to access past episodes of Right to the Point podcast and Right to the Point commentary, and if you'd like to support the podcast, please visit lifepointusa.org. So glad you've joined us here today. In this episode, we welcome my friend, Pennsylvania State Senator Doug Mastriano. He is a combat veteran, a son of a career Navy man, an Eagle Scout, worked as a paperboy, janitor, security guard, and short order cook, served in the U.S. Army in 1986, and served on the Iron Curtain with the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in West Germany, went on to serve in Washington, D.C., the 3rd Infantry Division, and U.S. Army in Europe as well. Has a Doctor of History degree, 4 master's degrees, and he is retired from the United States Army as a colonel. And we welcome him. He is also a senator in Pennsylvania, state senator, and we welcome him to the Right to the Point podcast today. Senator Mastriano, it's a delight to have you along with us. And I want to thank you for your service to our nation and for being my friend. God bless you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, I love just hanging out with you because of your love of history. And as I look in the background, I see Gettysburg, and I see your backyard, basically. So if you would, let's talk a little bit about history as we get started, because we are rich in our nation. We have such a godly heritage. And with that being taken away from so many Americans over the last few decades, how has that made us poor? How has that affected our nation? How would you contextualize that as far as where we are as a nation because we haven't taught American history?
I mean, going back to Joshua chapter 4, when the children of Israel are finally entering the promised land, and as they're about to cross the Jordan River, God gives instructions to Joshua, who's now in charge, that each tribe needs to grab a stone out of the bed of the dried up Jordan River, which God will dry up, and then plant it on the western side of the Israel side of the river. And he says, so that when you and your children pass by these in later years, you'll remember what God did for you. And so those are called memorial stones. What you see behind me are memorial stones in my district at the battlefield of Gettysburg. That's a giant Pennsylvania monument there with all 32,246 names of every Pennsylvanian that fought there. And there's names on there, and these remember. Some people go down the panels, Tim, and they say, that's a relative of mine. This regiment was from Mercer County. That's got to be one of my relatives. And you remember the sacrifice. You remember where you came from. You remember how this country was built and how we have these freedoms today. And when you're disconnected from that understanding of where you're from, how you were founded, what were the ideals that drove this nation here, then you're vulnerable to deception. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote actually at a speech in Harvard in 1983, after being released from Siberian labor camps, archipelagos, they called them gulags, out in Siberia. He came and spoke. Reagan worked real hard to get his freedom, and he said that he's used to ask his grandparents when he was a kid in the 1930s, why did all these things happen to the great Russian Empire? It used to be a bulwark of Christianity, had a lot of problems, obviously, but how did this horror of 60 million dead happen to this once great, powerful people? And his grandparents would say, well, we forgot God. And then he went on to research the Soviet Revolution for the next 50 years of his life as a historian. And he said, if I had to sum up in one phrase why all these things happened, not only the 60 million, but then, World War II, 25 million more killed, in the war with the Nazis. He said, all this happened simply because we have forgotten God. And I believe, that's connected with your history.
Yes. Amen. Now, Gettysburg, which is a place I love to visit. There are so many memorable places there. I think I can walk out on Little Round Top and just sit there and absorb the story of Chamberlain and his men from the 20th Maine. Kind of describe how important this place is, because Gettysburg it's just a Civil War battle. No, it is a turning point that not only affected the outcome of the Civil War, but affected who we are and as a nation today.
It really is critical. And, there's in great deeds, something abides, Chamberlain said as he dedicated the monument to 20th Maine at the base of Little Round Top in 1886. In great deeds, something abides, and he talks about how shapes will change, but something endures there. And at the base of Little Round Top, our nation's future was really decided, whether there would be a United States of America. We take it for granted since it was secured for us. But at that moment, we were at a crossroads. The major European powers of the United Kingdom, France, and Spain were poised and ready to recognize the Confederacy and fight by their side. If that had happened, we'd be speaking a German dialect or a Southern twang. I don't know how it would shape out, with the defeated United States, but our world would be different. And how would it be different? 1918, World War I, the Allies had been at it for 4 years against the Axis powers and Central powers. And, the French army had mutinied. The Soviet army had collapsed into the Bolshevik Revolution. The British were worn out. And the Germans had one more push left in them. They had 1 million men from the Eastern Front. They were shifting over to the Western Front to knock out the West and win the war. But guess what? America showed up and turned the tide. It was only because of America that Europeans remained freed and that the Germans were defeated. World War II, 1944, 1945, whether it's in the Pacific or Europe, fighting militarism in the Pacific and Nazism, fascism in Europe. It was the United States that won and defeated those powers with a lot of help from allies, but we were the leaders. We were the arsenal of democracy. And so when you go to Gettysburg, we have that rich history because of the sacrifice of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and so many others that fell in that bloodiest battle in all of North America.
And these are just regular Americans that left home to do this. And it occurs to me, I was at a tree lighting ceremony last night in my hometown here in Southern Ohio at the courthouse. And just regular Americans who are serving locally have an impact. Those who serve in the military, you, sir, and all of the things you were involved in, and the men I was going through looking at your Facebook page today, and I was seeing all those you remember. You constantly are bringing to remembrance those who gave their lives and sacrificed everything that they had, and that we can be free today. We must not forget those lives. We can't do it, can we?
No. And so every day you'll see 3 to 5 posts of Pennsylvanians, and this is just Pennsylvanians, mostly young men, just starting life. And, when you lose them that young, I say they lose 2 lives, the lives they're living and the ones yet they're going to have, maybe get married and have kids and get a regular job. And you look at the sacrifice. Some of these guys, they look like they're 15, especially from the Vietnam era. I mean, it's like, he's just so young. And they gave it their all, the last full measure of devotion, as Lincoln would say in his Gettysburg Address. They gave it all so that you and I and every other American can be free. And it took a lot of effort to research and pull all those names. And we go back to Vietnam. Our goal is to go back, keep on going back further. But people need to remember. And Tim, it's really heartbreaking when you read on there and a brother or a sister or an uncle or a friend or a fellow soldier will write a remembrance about them. And it really makes it personal, and it almost breaks you down in tears. This is somebody like me.
Yeah, exactly. Before we get to some current events, and I want to talk to you about what's happening in America and the world, but I want to also take time and hear you for a moment. This is Christmas season, and there's a moment for us as we look at Operation Christmas Child and other ways that churches and individuals can minister. But there are great ministries that are working to share Christmas joy with veterans and veterans groups. Talk about how important it is for those who feel forgotten this time of year.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time. Obviously, I've spent Christmases away in the Middle East, in combat zones, in Afghanistan. And so it's really, really hard to be away from home at such an occasion that you remember family and you're wondering what they're doing. And and how you're missing out on the joy with your kids and your wife and, friends and family. And you're just so far away, in a distant land with a foreign culture that has really no wish you Merry Christmas, but nothing to do with Christianity and their culture. And so it's so important that you just take a minute to remember them. I mean, communication now is so much easier. In Desert Storm, my first Christmas away from home, I mean, it took letters 2 to 4 weeks to reach you in the desert. So now it's so much easier with communications. But, do send a care package if you have somebody in the military serving overseas, even if it's not a combat zone. Send a care package with just something from home. If you're from Pennsylvania, something from Pennsylvania. Something that they'll cherish, remember as part of your family's celebration of Jesus, and it's important that they were remembered. That's all.
Yeah, very good, very good. Well, let's talk about the Middle East if we can. There are two things about what happened on October 7th that just seem to overwhelm us. First is the terror and the demonic influence there, and some of the acts of terror that took place. Secondly, it's the rise or unveiling, if you will, of anti-Semitism in our nation, not just in the world, but in our nation. This is an amazing moment. We've got to be smart. We've got to be good stewards of this as Christians and as influencers in our nation today, don't we?
We really do. And, it's remained not just because of what happened October 7th, but this is a time of courage. This is where, God is looking for good men and women to stand up, because bad things happen when good men and women do nothing, if I'll borrow from that one historian from the 1800s. Yeah. And so when you complain about how bad things they, currently are, what are you doing about it to stem the tide? What are you doing about it to protect our freedoms so that your kids and grandkids can enjoy the same freedoms that you and I grew up with? And now it's time to do something about it. And, doing something about it, it's not a big demand. It's making sure, number one, you vote, and number two, back a candidate that has your values, back a candidate with your donations, with your volunteer hours, something more than just sitting around complaining and all those politicians in Harrisburg and DC are corrupt. Okay, if you really believe it, then maybe you ought to run for office yourself and make a difference. Start off with a school board, start off in the local government, county commissioner or supervisor in a township or what have you. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities. If you don't have the wherewithal to do it, then find somebody you can get behind. That somebody might need a nudge. Somebody had to nudge me. I mean, so this is not something I wanted to do. Now, on the other token here, the anti-Semitism, I'm appalled by it. Here's one thing that's gone, cross-eyed with the left. The left, to oppress and bully and threaten and to keep, wealthy Christian business donors from giving to candidates, they'll accuse a candidate, like me, of being, anti this, anti that, something phobic, and just a whole list. And they have Christian businessmen and women scared to stand on their values. I mean, Tim, I take it for granted. I figured that, these people believe the same things I do, they do, but they're not willing to sacrifice anything or take any risks. If they lose a few bucks there, that's okay, but they'll leave conservative candidates hanging high and dry, which happened in a lot of cases last year because the Democrat machine under Shapiro and the media fabricated all these allegations of hate and phobic, and this is same. Your eyes kind of roll in the back of your head, like, here we go again. They're completely baseless. They're fabricated. It's a big stretch in logic to even come up with this, but they'll just throw it out there. They'll perpetuate it, and then people that have money to help candidates, they run and hide. So you don't love your country, clearly, because you want the Democrat to win. I have a big business in my district here, has given a lot to me, and they took it on the chin. And I hope to have the courage and endurance to stay in the fight and not be coward and allow people less worthy, people don't have our values, run for office. The second thing here is we do have to stand with the Jewish people. In Romans chapter 15, Paul talks about how I really need to come to the Church of Rome. I want to visit you Christians in Rome. I'm planning on going out to Spain first, but before all that happens, the Greek people in northern and southern Greek and Macedonia and Achaia, they've made a big donation for me to bring to Jerusalem to help the poor saints, the poor Jewish saints in Jerusalem, for relief from a famine that was going on. And Paul goes on to say, and I'm going to paraphrase in modern language, we've reaped this beautiful spiritual harvest from the Jewish people, from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're debtors to them spiritually. Therefore, we need to administer to them in the flesh, in the carnal, in the flesh, where we can. And so, right now, our Jewish brothers and sisters, they need our support. They need our backing. They are at war with a vicious, relentless enemy. We haven't seen this level of horror at such a grand scale since the Nazis. And let me tell you just one difference. The Nazis were horrific. 6 million Jews eliminated. Just kids, women, children, all ages, artists to laborers. I mean, every strata of society from across every corner of Europe. I stood on the plots in Warsaw, the Ubungsplatz, where 250,000 Jews, most of them died, were sent down to Auschwitz on a train stop in Warsaw. I stood on a spot where in 1943, those surviving in the Jewish ghetto, waiting to die, rose up and fought the Nazis and made the Nazis pay a big price, led by Mordecai and so many others. It was awful what happened. What's interesting to me, though, Tim, is the Nazis, there was shame. When they had these ersatz squads, these special squads going around and shooting lines and lines of Jewish men, women, and children, those squads couldn't cope with what they were doing, and they would get drunk. They would be intoxicated constantly to cope with it. The Nazis try to hide what they did. What happened by Hamas on October 7th, they didn't try to hide anything. We have images of a guy walking around, one of these murderer terrorists walking around with the severed head of a young man. Another one excitedly with calling, Dad, I've just killed so many Jews, put Mom on the phone. And his dad's like, I'm so proud of you. I mean, this is a level of evil that we haven't seen in modern life. Yeah.
And the biblical meaning here, I mean, Gaza of all places, Philistine. This is really a moment in our history that should cause us to wake up if we're not overwhelmed and intoxicated with all the misinformation that is everywhere. For Christians, this should cause us to really dial in and pay attention, shouldn't it?
Yeah, it should. And, so we have a Jewish legacy in that area going, between 3,000 and 5,000 years, depending if you want to go with Abraham passing through the land or with David, coming in and conquering it, or Joshua for that matter. And Jerusalem is the capital of Israel because King David captured it from the Jebusites. The Jebusites said the blind and lame can't capture this fortress of ours, and David did. So, and it's been the symbol of Israel for literally millennium. And what's interesting, so the Arabs that are there, these Palestinians are not Philistines, they're Arabs. The Arabs came in with Muhammad's army when they conquered this Christian area, and all of North Africa and that part of the Middle East was Christian, Greek Christian, at least led by the Greek eastern part of the church. And so around 700 AD, when the Arab army swept through, they slowly populated the area, and so the true Egyptians, the Egyptians that would go back, to Cleopatra's time. Now I know she's Greek, but the true Egyptians are the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt, not the ruling Arabs. The Arabs came in with the Islamic armies, and so. But it's interesting because Philistia was, of course, a group called the Sea Peoples, believed to be Greek people from Crete that first landed and attacked Egypt, were beaten back, and then they realigned and entered into modern day Israel and carved off Gaza, and Gath, where Goliath was from, and Ashkelon, and all these other territories that were a thorn in the side of Israel for almost its entire existence.
Yes, and it's to those who want to say something about occupation is always a word that causes my ears to perk up. When you use that phrase, you better be using it correctly, and it's not used correctly. It's used it's just like church and state. It's always used in an opposite place. One of the things I so admire about you, Senator, is that you're willing to stand for truth. And you're attacked a lot. I seem to be drawn to people that get attacked a lot because they're usually doing the right thing. And that's true in your case, and you're making and have made a great difference there in Pennsylvania. But I want you to know, I believe your championing of history will have a lasting effect, a generational impact, long beyond your moment there. Because if we catch our history, then we are going to be better off for it. And I'm around a lot of pastors, a lot of churches every week. When I talk about American history, they'll ask me, what's the most important thing we need to teach about our American history? What's the most important thing we need to say? And I know what my answer is, but what would you say to those who say, I don't know how much I should dwell on our nation's founding? I think it fits well with the biblical model of who we are to be as citizens. But what say you to that person that has that question?
Clearly our founding is imperative to understanding, the vision and goals and what our founding fathers had in mind. I mean, this separation of church and state is a fabrication based off of a 1804 letter, a private letter between Thomas Jefferson and a Baptist pastor in Rhode Island. It's not in the Constitution. And the way the Constitution is written, for instance, if you read the original documents and it's there, people should read the Constitution, annually, is to remember what your rights are. So when the government comes in and tells you otherwise, you're like, no, wait a second. But it's to protect religion from being corrupted by government, not the other way around. There was never an intention by our founders or anyone up until the 1960s to push out religion. And so the Supreme Court for the past 20 some years now has been using something called the Lemon Test, as a pretense to separate religion from public life. And what one thing people don't realize is this pretense, this case that's been used as a precedent to force out religion from public life has been struck down by the Supreme Court. And so the Lemon Test no longer exists. And this is a beautiful thing, because now people's religious faith can come back to the public life, come back to the government, come back to the public sector and public schools. But we have a lot of solicitors and lawyers that are risk adverse, that don't know that the Lemon Test has been, overruled and cast out as bad law. So there's a move across the nation, and we heard from David Barton a couple weeks ago at his conference to bring lawsuits forth to set precedents to remind people the Lemon Test is gone. Now, here's the beauty, because sadly, of course, this has been abused by Satanists and others. Somebody gets a 10 Commandments monument, and then you see this ridiculous monument of Satan popping up next to it. That monument has no root in American history. And the beautiful thing about the striking down of the Lemon Test is that the new precedent set forth by the Supreme Court says Christmas songs, Christmas carols, Christmas trees, Christmas songs that are Christian, not just, snowmen and reindeer, like so many schools have cowered to, just, kind of pop culture, got to keep religion out. If there's a basis in American history for these things, they're allowed, they're permitted. So now these statues of Baal, that are popping up, there's no basis in American practice and history and culture for those. But the 10 Commandments, Christian practices that are traditional and rooted in America, celebrated by Abraham Lincoln, going back to George Washington and all our founding fathers, even Thomas Jefferson, the least religious. Today, he'd be a radical conservative Christian, right, by our terms today. Yeah. But all these now are allowed in the public life.
Yep, exactly. Rick Green and I, Patriot Academy, Rick from Patriot Academy.
Yes.
There's this thing that happens when a Christian hears our history and our godly heritage. And if they know the Lord, they're serving the Lord, but they don't know their history because they haven't been taught that. And it happens over and over. It happens to you, I'm sure. There's a moment where the dots connect and they think, oh, that's why. And things begin to make sense that never made sense before. And it's a beautiful thing. And I tell pastors, I dare you to teach, to share our history, our heritage. Your folks will be enriched by it. And they'll be better. They'll be better citizens, and which will make your communities better as well. So
I agree.
Well, Senator, thank you so very much. I just wanted to spend some time, introduce my audience to you and your good work there in Pennsylvania and your heart. I've always appreciated your heart. I recently was in Pennsylvania. You gave me a tour of the Capitol, and it was very meaningful. I still think back to that fondly, and I pray that you have a wonderful Christmas season. You and your wife and your family, may you be blessed, and all your efforts be blessed there in Pennsylvania and beyond, sir.
Thank you. And one final thought. So as the Battle of Little Round Top was raging, and you had this professor who had a speech impediment for most of his life on the base of the hill,
Yeah.
Chamberlain, trying to hold back the Alabamans. Further up were the Texans, the 4th and 5th Texans, had crested the hill, had broken through the line. And then the 140th New York under Patrick O'Rourke showed up and stopped them. And in their history, the 4th and 5th Texans wrote, "We won every battle until God stopped us on Little Round Top." Thank you and Merry Christmas.
God bless you, sir. All the best. Bye now. Well, we had a great conversation there with Senator Doug Mastriano. Thank you so much for joining me on this edition of Right to the Point. To learn more about Life Point Ministries and to access past episodes of Right to the Point podcasts and commentary, and if you'd like to support the podcast, visit us at lifepointusa.org. Stay in love with the Lord and in love with one another, and we'll see you next time for a fresh edition of Right to the Point.